The office was nearly empty, save for the distant hum of cleaning machines and the occasional echo of a shoe on marble. Elliot Grayson sat alone in the high-rise boardroom, his tailored suit stiff from a long day of meetings, mergers, and people nodding to things they didn't mean. The city pulsed below him, windows lit like a restless sea, but he felt none of its rhythm. In front of him, untouched canapes curled at the edges. The executive dinner had ended hours ago. The board had gone home. And still, he lingered. He wasn't hungry. He rarely was these days. But he stayed. Some part of him, dulled by years of polished monotony, wanted to feel something, anything. So he watched the lights flicker, one tower blinking into darkness, another coming to life. The city changed, but he did not. He stood up to leave when he noticed a movement by the catering table. A man, thin, quiet, and almost invisible, was packing the leftover food with mechanical precision. Not stealing, not rushing, just careful, methodical. Elliot didn't recognize him at first. Most CEOs don't know the janitorial staff by name, but the man had been around for years, always in the background, mopping floors, wiping tables, emptying bins. Luis, he remembered. The man had kind eyes but carried himself like someone used to being unseen. Something about the scene halted Elliot at the threshold. Luis wasn't eating, he was packing. 4 small containers, evenly filled. No waste. He glanced around once, more out of habit than fear, then zipped the bag closed and walked out through the staff exit. Elliot hesitated, then followed. He didn't know why. It was late. He had a car waiting, but the sight of Luis, purposeful and silent in the night, stirred something buried in him, a question he couldn't name. He kept his distance, trailing behind through quiet alleys and dim-lit sidewalks. Luis moved with quiet determination, crossing under bridges and past closed storefronts. At one point, he stopped by a dumpster, not to search, but to leave something, a small, cleanly packed container placed gently atop a flattened box. Then he moved on. Elliot watched, puzzled. Luis wasn't feeding himself. He was leaving food behind for someone else. Further down, the path opened into a shadowed park. Luis veered off the main walkway and slipped through a narrow gate. Elliot followed, slower now, the ache in his knees reminding him he was no longer young. He paused by the gate, hiding in shadow. Beyond, scattered shapes emerged in the dark. Figures, people huddled on benches, beside shopping carts, beneath layered blankets. A small tent flapped in the breeze. Luis walked among them like someone visiting family greeting softly, offering a container to one woman with matted hair, setting another beside an older man who didn't stir. No one asked questions. No one seemed surprised. This wasn't the first time. Elliot stood frozen, the cold air biting through his coat. He didn't belong here, not just because of his suit or the sterile life he'd built, but because he'd never noticed any of this before. These people existed in the periphery of his life, blurred like smudges on a window. Now they were right in front of him. And Luis, the janitor, was moving among them with quiet grace, offering dignity in the form of a meal. For a long time, Elliot didn't move. He watched Luis finish his rounds, give a silent nod to the shadows, then turn and walk away. No fanfare. No thanks. Just a man doing what needed to be done. Elliot stayed behind a moment longer, staring at the small tent with a faint lantern glow inside. Then he turned back the way he came. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The image of Luis's hands offering food burned into his mind. Something in him had shifted, subtle but irreversible. He couldn't name it. Only that the silence inside him had grown louder. And for the first time in years, Elliot Grayson felt small, human, and he wasn't sure if it terrified him or set him free. Morning came, but the weight from the night before had not lifted. Elliot sat in his corner office, untouched espresso cooling beside him. The city stretched out beyond the glass like a canvas he no longer recognized. His executive assistant rattled off the day's schedule calls with European partners, a quarterly review, a photo op with a nonprofit the company had donated to, but her voice sounded distant, muffled by the memory of Luis's quiet footsteps in that shadowed park. Throughout the day, Elliot drifted. He nodded at meetings, responded to emails with practiced efficiency, but his mind returned, over and over, to the slow, deliberate way Luis had placed the containers down, to the stillness of the people who received them. He hadn't known hunger like that. He hadn't known what it meant to be invisible. Somewhere deep inside, that realization began to loosen something long dormant. He stayed late again that night. This time, he made it look accidental. He worked late often enough that no one questioned it. But tonight, he wasn't staying for the company. He waited, quiet in his office, lights dimmed, listening for the same rhythm of footsteps. And when they came soft, steady, unhurried, he rose and followed. Luis took the same path, his backpack already half full. Again, no hesitation. Again, the same care. Elliot kept to the shadows, heart pounding for reasons he didn't understand. He was a man used to control, yet here he was, sneaking behind a janitor like a child hiding from a parent. But he couldn't stop. He had to know more. Tonight, Luis walked further, past the park, past the dumpsters, past even the rougher parts of the neighborhood Elliot usually sped past in his tinted car. Eventually, he reached a run-down building, an old Surrey brick structure with a faded mural and boarded windows. But inside, there was life. Elliot watched from across the street as Luis knocked on a side door. A woman opened it. She was young, perhaps late 20s, with tired eyes and a posture too heavy for her frame. She smiled faintly when she saw Luis, then stepped aside to let him in. Elliot didn't follow this time. He waited, unsure of what he was doing or who he was becoming. After 15 minutes, Luis emerged again. This time, he wasn't carrying the food. He was holding a small mermaid, colorful paper bag crumpled at the edges, but handled with care. As he walked past, Elliot caught a glimpse inside crayons, a worn notebook, and a child's drawing folded neatly on top. Luis crossed the street and walked toward the bus stop. Elliot stayed behind, stunned by the weight of what he'd seen. He returned the next night, and the next. Each time, he learned a little more without words, without interaction, just by watching. Luis's routine was precise, driven not by obligation but by something deeper. He wasn't just helping people. He was holding something together, a quiet dignity, a thread of compassion stretching across the cracks of a broken world. Elliot started noticing things he never had before. The cafeteria worker who always served with a smile but winced when reaching overhead. The security guard who hummed lullabies under his breath between rounds. The woman from accounting who left exactly at 5:00 p.m. every day and walked 10 blocks in heels rather than spend money on a cab. He had never truly seen them. And yet, somehow, Luis had. That Friday. Elliot stood by the large glass window overlooking the city, his reflection barely visible against the backdrop of twilight. He watched his own silhouette, sleek and sharp, and wondered how long it had been since anyone had looked past it. How long since he thought of the drawing Luis carried, A child's sketch, something precious, a daughter. Maybe Elliot didn't know, but he wanted to. Not for curiosity's sake, but for something far more unfamiliar to him. Respect. The next time he followed, he didn't keep his distance. Not completely. At the park gate, Elliot stepped out of the shadows, keeping a respectful distance. Luis noticed. He didn't startle. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Elliot, eyes calm but guarded, and nodded once before returning to the group. That nod was nothing and everything. It meant Elliot was no longer invisible. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. Morning came, but the weight from the night before had not lifted. Elliot sat in his corner office, untouched espresso cooling beside him. The city stretched out beyond the glass, like a canvas he no longer recognized. His executive assistant rattled off the day's schedule calls with European partners, a quarterly review, a photo op with a nonprofit the company had donated to, but her voice sounded distant, muffled by the memory of Luis's quiet footsteps in that shadowed park. Throughout the day, Elliot drifted. He nodded at meetings, responded to emails with practiced efficiency, but his mind returned, over and over, to the slow, deliberate way Luis had placed the containers down, to the stillness of the people who received them. He hadn't known hunger like that. He hadn't known what it meant to be invisible. Somewhere deep inside, that realization began to loosen something long dormant. He stayed late again that night. This time, he made it look accidental. He worked late often enough that no one questioned it. But tonight, he wasn't staying for the company. He waited, quiet in his office, lights dimmed, listening for the same rhythm of footsteps. And when they came soft, steady, unhurried, he rose and followed. Luis took the same path, his backpack already half full. Again. No hesitation. Again. The same care. Elliot kept to the shadows, heart pounding for reasons he didn't understand. He was a man used to control, yet here he was, sneaking behind a janitor like a child hiding from a parent. But he couldn't stop. He had to know more. Tonight, Luis walked further, past the park, past the dumpsters, past even the rougher parts of the neighborhood Elliot usually sped past in his tinted car. Eventually, he reached a rundown building, an old brick structure with a faded mural and boarded windows. But inside, there was life. Elliot watched from across the street as Luis knocked on a side door. A woman opened it. She was young, perhaps late 20s, with tired eyes and a posture too heavy for her frame. She smiled faintly when she saw Luis, then stepped aside to let him in. Elliot didn't follow this time. He waited, unsure of what he was doing or who he was becoming. After 15 minutes, Luis emerged again. This time, he wasn't carrying the food. He was holding a small, colorful paper bag crumpled at the edges, but handled with care. As he walked past, Elliot caught a glimpse inside crayons, a worn notebook, and a child's drawing folded neatly on top. Luis crossed the street and walked toward the bus stop. Elliot stayed behind, stunned by the weight of what he'd seen. He returned the next night, and the next. Each time, he learned a little more without words, without interaction, just by watching. Luis's routine was precise, driven not by obligation, but by something deeper. He wasn't just helping people. He was holding something together, a quiet dignity, a thread of compassion stretching across the cracks of a broken world. Elliot started noticing things he never had before. The cafeteria worker who always served with a smile but winced when reaching overhead. The security guard who hummed lullabies under his breath between rounds. The woman from accounting who left exactly at 5:00 p.m. every day and walk 10 blocks in heels rather than spend money on a cab. He had never truly seen them. And yet, somehow, Luis had. That Friday, Elliot stood by the large glass window overlooking the city, his reflection barely visible against the backdrop of twilight. He watched his own silhouette, sleek and sharp, and wondered how long it had been since anyone had looked past it. How long since he had. He thought of the drawing Luis carried. A child's sketch, something precious. A daughter. Maybe Elliot didn't know. But he wanted to. Not for curiosity's sake, but for something far more unfamiliar to him. Respect. The next time he followed, he didn't keep his distance. Not completely. At the park gate, Elliot stepped out of the shadows, keeping a respectful distance. Luis noticed. He didn't startle. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Elliot, eyes calm but guarded, and nodded once before returning to the group. That nod was nothing, and everything. It meant Elliot was no longer invisible, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. Elliot had spent most of his life mastering silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that keeps people at arm's length. Boardroom silences, negotiation pauses, dinners without conversation. He thought silence was control. But that night in the park, when Luis met his eyes and nodded without a word, the silence was different. It wasn't cold. It was acknowledgement, an invitation to witness, not intrude. The following evening, Elliot didn't hide. He arrived at the same hour, alone, dressed simply, no suit, no briefcase. He stood near the entrance to the park, watching Luis unpack his bag, distributing food with quiet familiarity. An elderly man smiled, toothless but bright-eyed. A young mother received her portion and gently woke her son for a warm bite. Each exchange was brief, but deeply human. When Luis noticed Elliot again, he walked toward him, not hurried, not hesitant, just calm. "You lost?" Luis asked, voice rough with exhaustion but not unkind. Elliot shook his head. "I saw you here a few nights ago. I didn't mean to intrude." Luis glanced over his shoulder at the community he had served for years. "You weren't intruding, just watching." A pause settled between them, but it wasn't tense. Elliot studied the man's face, weathered, quiet, but steady. "Why do you do it?" he asked. Luis didn't answer right away. He looked at the sky, at the buildings glowing beyond the trees. "Because someone once did it for me," he said finally, "and I couldn't pay them back. So now I pay it forward." It wasn't a rehearsed line. It came from somewhere deep, somewhere lived. Elliot nodded, unsure what to say. Luis turned to leave, but paused. "Walk with me." They walked side by side. No destination spoken. Luis handed Elliot a container without asking, and together they moved from person to person. No introductions, no explanations. Just two men, one learning, the other sharing. Afterwards, they sat on a bench in silence. Across from them, a small girl in a tattered hoodie colored on the back of a cardboard box with a crayon that had seen better days. Her mother gently brushed her hair with trembling fingers. Luis finally spoke. "My daughter's name is Sophia. She's 8, has cerebral palsy, smart as hell, draws better than I ever could." Elliot turned slightly, surprised by the offering of personal truth. "I take her to a community center during the day. They help with therapy. It's not enough, but it's something. Nights, I clean. Weekends, I fix things. Sundays, we rest." The simplicity struck Elliot harder than any financial report ever had. "What about her mother?" he asked, hesitantly. Luis's jaw clenched slightly. But his voice remained steady. She left when Sophia was 3. Said it was too hard. I don't blame her anymore, but I had to make a choice. And I chose my daughter. Elliot felt something sharp stir in his chest. A memory his own mother, walking out, her coat barely brushing his shoulder as she passed. He'd never asked why, never got an answer. He was 7. You're a good father, Elliot said quietly. Luis gave a tired smile. I try. That's all any of us can do. The wind shifted. Night deepened. Voices quieted in the distance as people settled in. Luis stood. I have to go. Sophia waits up for me with her drawings. Elliot stood too, unsure of the proper goodbye. Luis didn't offer one, just a small nod as always. But this time, Elliot nodded back. He watched Luis disappear into the city, not as a janitor, not as a poor man, not even as a quiet one, but as a father, a caretaker, a man with purpose. And for the first time in a long while, Elliot didn't feel like a spectator in his own life. He felt like a man waking up. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full. Monday morning returned with its usual rhythm glass elevators. Polite smiles, elevator chimes, screens flashing with numbers that measured things Elliot no longer cared about. He sat through meetings with practiced poise, but something had shifted. He no longer leaned forward, no longer interrupted. He listened, but not to numbers. He listened to silences, to pauses, to the fatigue behind a manager's cheerful report. He saw the hollowness in the eyes of the junior staffer trying to prove her worth. Luis had cracked something open, not with anger or speeches, but with the simplest thing Elliot had long forgotten: presence. That afternoon, while walking the hallways alone, Elliot noticed the small things again. A stack of broken chairs no one had repaired. A vending machine with a handwritten out-of-order sign taped clumsily to the glass. He stepped into the janitorial storage closet somewhere he'd never once entered in 15 years and stood silently. The air smelled of ammonia and damp cotton. A single flickering bulb buzzed overhead. In one corner, tucked beside a mop bucket, was a child's drawing. Crayons on cheap paper, a small girl, her limbs drawn in bold and crooked lines, beside a tall man holding her hand. Above them, in large, careful letters, me and Papa. He didn't touch it, just stared. Later that evening, he found himself walking again, not to his car, not home, but toward the train station Luis had once mentioned. He didn't call ahead. He didn't know if he was invited. He arrived at the old brick building, faded, tired, but humming with quiet life. The community center. Inside, the lobby was modest second-hand chairs, faded posters, a cracked water dispenser. But the energy felt different, warm. A woman behind the desk looked up and smiled, clearly surprised to see a man in loafers and a $1,000 coat standing uncertainly like a lost tourist. I'm looking for Luis Ramirez, Elliot said. The woman nodded. He's in room 2, art therapy night. Elliot walked down a narrow hallway lined with children's drawings. Birds with mismatched wings, houses with too many windows. One, a simple crayon sun with a smiling face, made him pause. It had been decades since he'd drawn anything, since he had allowed anything imperfect to carry meaning. He reached room 2. Inside, Luis sat on the floor beside a girl in a wheelchair. Her hands moved slowly across the page, gripping a crayon tightly. She had sharp, intelligent eyes, and she laughed without restraint. Her smile filled the room. Elliot stayed in the doorway, uncertain. Luis looked up, surprised but not startled. You found us, he said. Elliot nodded. I wanted to meet her. Luis gestured him in. Sophia, this is Mr. Elliot. He's a friend from work. Sophia squinted at him, curious. You don't look like a janitor. Elliot laughed. I'm not, but I should be so lucky. She grinned, accepting the answer, and went back to coloring. Elliot sat beside her, knees stiff from disuse. He watched as she carefully added blue sky behind a lopsided tree. It was messy, beautiful. Luis handed Elliot a blank page and a crayon. No judgment here, he said. Elliot stared at the crayon. He hadn't held one in years. Slowly, awkwardly, he began to draw a circle, then another, a figure. It looked ridiculous, but it didn't matter. For 10 quiet minutes, they all colored, and for 10 minutes, Elliot forgot about his inbox, the boardroom, the stockholders. He remembered something simpler, something quieter, a forgotten version of himself. Later, when the session ended and they stepped outside, Sophia fast asleep in her chair, Luis turned to him. You don't have to keep showing up, you know? I know, Elliot replied. But I want to. Luis studied him for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity. Most people show up once. They feel better about themselves. Then they disappear. I'm not most people, Elliot said. Luis nodded, slow and deliberate. We'll see. They said nothing more. Elliot helped lift Sophia gently into a modest van. As they drove off, he stood alone beneath a flickering street lamp. The building behind him glowed faintly with late-night warmth. The world beyond buzzed with noise and neon. But in Elliot's chest, something different stirred. Not guilt, not charity, commitment, not yet fully formed, but real. Something was beginning, and this time, he wasn't walking away. The days that followed settled into an odd rhythm. Elliot still arrived at the office early, wore tailored suits, and signed off on contracts worth millions. But each morning, something clung to him in awareness, like a second skin. The way the receptionist's shoulders slumped when she thought no one was watching. The sound of janitorial carts moving through the hallway, ignored by everyone except him. The whispered laughter of interns over shared coffee they could barely afford. He began taking different routes through the building, not the polished executive hallways, but the back corridors. He passed storage rooms where overworked staff took quiet breaks, crossed paths with kitchen workers, nodded to people who didn't know how to respond. His presence made them uncomfortable at first, then confused, then curious. One evening, just before leaving, Elliot stood in the break room. It was a small, overlooked space with a fridge that groaned and a microwave that smelled faintly of burnt noodles. He placed 2 boxes of pastries on the counter. No note, no branding, just something small, something human. He didn't wait to see who found them. That night, he returned to the community center. Sophia was coloring again, this time drawing a garden of mismatched flowers. Luis greeted him with a quiet nod. No questions, no ceremony, just a simple acceptance that Elliot was becoming part of something outside of his usual world. Later, while Sophia played with other children, the 2 men sat outside on the back steps, listening to the city breathe. You don't talk much about your past, Luis said. I don't think about it much, Elliot replied. That's not the same thing. Elliot didn't respond right away. The sky above was streaked with the last shades of dusk, and somewhere in the distance, someone played a soft tune on a saxophone. My father left when I was 6. My mother 3 years later. She didn't die. She just stopped showing up. I went through a few homes, then boarding schools. After that, It was all about rising, climbing, proving I could make something of myself. And you did, Luis said. Elliot let out a slow breath. I thought success would silence the questions. That if I built enough, bought enough, became enough, it would make sense. Luis glanced at him, and it didn't. A long silence passed between them. Not uncomfortable, just full. Maybe that's why you noticed me, Luis said quietly. People like us, we know what absence feels like. Elliot turned to him, surprised. People like us? Luis shrugged. Doesn't matter what floor you work on. Pain levels us all. Elliot looked down at his hands. They had signed checks, shaken hands with politicians, held crystal glasses in private lounges. But lately, they had also carried food containers, colored awkwardly with a crayon, helped lift a sleeping child into a van. Do you ever get tired, he asked. Luis smiled without humor. Every day, but Sophia's worth waking up for. They said nothing more. When Elliot returned to his condo that night, the silence wasn't as heavy. He walked past the framed awards, the panoramic view of the skyline, the untouched wine bottles. In his study, he opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a photograph, him at 12, expression blank, standing beside a foster home's Christmas tree, no presents, no parents, just that flat, hollow stare. He placed it on his desk. Then, for the first time in decades, he took out a blank notebook and began to write. He didn't know why, only that he needed to. The words came slowly at first, then steadily. They weren't business plans or speeches. They were memories, regrets, names, small moments he thought he had forgotten. The night he ran from a home and waited all evening under a bridge hoping his mother would come back. The social worker with tired eyes who slipped him a granola bar without a word. The first time he felt powerful when he told a lie at age 16 and got away with it. Each story he wrote down made him feel less like a stranger to himself. By midnight, 5 pages lay before him, and somewhere beneath the roar of the city, something inside him had finally begun to speak. Not in words of success, but in truth. The following weeks unfolded with quiet transformations. Elliot's shifts weren't visible to most. He was still the CEO, still impeccably dressed, still on time. But beneath the surface, something had fractured, then reformed. His office remained the same minimalist furniture, towering windows, neatly aligned reports. But now, tucked into the far corner of his desk drawer, hidden beneath financial forecasts, was Sophia's drawing, the one with crooked limbs and wide smiles. Me and Papa. It read, sometimes in between meetings. He'd pull it out and just look at it. He hadn't told Luis. Some things weren't meant to be spoken. They were meant to be carried. One Thursday morning, Elliot paused outside the janitor's locker room. He stood there for several seconds before knocking, an odd tension in his chest. The door opened to reveal Luis, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. Didn't expect to see you here, Luis said, not unfriendly, just puzzled. Elliot glanced around the room, old lockers, worn boots lined up under benches, shelves lined with off-brand cleaning supplies. I want to ask you something, Elliot said, but not as your boss. Luis raised an eyebrow, waiting. Would you ever speak at a company meeting? Luis blinked. Me, yes. About what you do, about what this world looks like from where you stand. Luis crossed his arms. Why? Because most of the people upstairs don't know what's happening downstairs, and I think it's time they did. There was a long pause. Luis studied him, trying to read whether this was another publicity stunt, a PR move dressed in sincerity, But Elliot didn't fill the silence. He let it stretch, steady and honest. Finally, Luis exhaled. All right, I'll think about it. That afternoon, Elliot did something else unexpected. He canceled a quarterly press conference and instead invited the executive team to an informal lunch held not in the boardroom, but in the staff cafeteria. No catering, no assistants, just him at a plastic table, eating what the employees ate. The room buzzed with confusion. Some were uncomfortable, others curious, but Elliot didn't explain. He simply sat, listened, and asked questions. Where do you live? How long's your commute? What do you wish we saw at first? The answers were guarded, but gradually people began to speak about the cost of childcare, the stress of late-night shifts, how health benefits barely covered emergencies. Elliot nodded. He took notes. He didn't promise change, not yet. That night, at the community center, he found Luis watching Sophia draw. This time, the picture was a house. The lines were off, but the door was wide, and the sun was high in the sky. She says that's our future home, Luis murmured. A real one, with a yard, maybe a dog. Elliot sat down beside him. It's a good dream, he said. Luis was quiet for a moment, then asked, why are you really doing this? You've already got everything. Elliot hesitated, then answered honestly, I've built buildings, bought companies, stood on stages. But the first time I felt like a man worth becoming was when your daughter handed me a crayon. Luis looked at him, and something in his gaze softened. You ever think about what kind of legacy you'll leave? Luis asked. All the time, Elliot replied. But now, I'm thinking about whether it'll matter to anyone who never knew my name. They sat in silence for a long while, listening to children laugh in the other room. Sophia's voice rose above the others, clear and joyful. She was telling a story, something about a magic tree that fed the whole village. When the center closed, Elliot helped Luis load Sophia into the van again. Before Luis got into the driver's seat, he paused. I'll speak at your meeting, he said. Elliot nodded. Thank you. As the van pulled away, Elliot remained on the curb. The street was quiet, except for the distant bark of a dog and the soft hum of a neon sign flickering to life. He looked up at the tall buildings around him, glass towers built in his name, glowing in the night. And for the first time, he saw them not as monuments of power, but as empty shells if they stood apart from the people below. What mattered wasn't what he'd built. It was what he would leave behind. The company-wide meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, mandatory attendance. Full auditorium, no streaming, no summaries. The executive team expected a typical quarterly recap: numbers, projections, applause. But Elliot had quietly changed the agenda. He stood behind the curtain as the room filled rows of polished shoes, pressed suits, lanyards and titles. People who lived by calendars and margins. He watched them in silence, not with judgment, but with a growing awareness of how many of them, like him once, had never looked beyond the spreadsheet, never questioned the systems they inherited. Backstage, Luis stood beside him, straightening his second-hand jacket, the collar stiff and unfamiliar. He looked calm, but Elliot noticed the tightness in his shoulders. You don't have to impress anyone, Elliot said. Luis gave a faint smile. I know. That's not why I'm here. The lights dimmed. The chatter died down. Elliot walked onto the stage alone. No slideshow, no teleprompter, just him, standing before a sea of employees who had come to expect a certain kind of message. But today was different. Good morning, he began, his voice steady but quieter than usual. This won't be the meeting you're used to. He let that settle before continuing. I've spent the last 20 years climbing ladders, corporate, financial, social. I thought I understood success. I thought I knew value. I was wrong. Because for years, I never once stepped into the world that keeps this company standing. Not the boardroom, the basement, the loading dock, the janitorial closet. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Elliot didn't flinch. So today, I've asked someone to speak. Someone who's worked in this building longer than most of us. Someone we've all passed in the hallway without seeing. Today, I want us to listen to the floor we never looked down on. He turned and gestured to the side. Luis walked out slowly, not nervous, but grounded. There was nothing performative in his steps, just purpose. He stood at the center of the stage and looked out. No notes, no podium, just truth. "My name is Luis Ramirez," he began. "I clean your offices. I pick up what's left behind after the long meetings and the catered lunches. Most of you don't know me. That's all right. I didn't come here so you'd remember my name. I came to remind you who keeps this place alive." He paused. "There's a floor in this building B2 that no one ever visits unless something breaks. That's where we eat lunch. That's where we hang our coats. That's where we talk about your names, your offices, your habits. Not out of resentment, out of reality, because we see what you leave behind." He looked around the room, his voice calm but unwavering. "I don't need praise. I don't need a plaque. I need you to understand that success isn't built from the top down. It's held up from the bottom. The cafeteria worker with 2 kids, the security guard whose mother is sick, the temp worker saving every cent for tuition. We're not beneath you. We're the foundation you've forgotten." Silence. Not defensive, not dismissive, just stunned. Luis finished simply, "If you want to lead, start by seeing. If you want to matter, start by listening." He stepped back. The applause didn't come right away. When it did, it was slow, uncertain, then full, not out of courtesy, but recognition. Elliot walked back to the mic. "We will be restructuring our leadership mentorship program, starting with paid rotations through every department: janitorial, kitchen, reception, security. Every executive will spend 1 week shadowing roles they've never touched. Not to teach, to learn." Some faces looked confused, others skeptical, but many nodded because something had shifted. The meeting ended without coffee or networking. People left quietly, some shaken, some thoughtful. All changed. Afterward, in the hallway, a junior analyst stopped Luis. "My dad worked night shifts his whole life. I never told anyone here. Thank you for saying what I couldn't." Luis nodded. "Your story matters too." In the elevator, Elliot stood beside his VP of operations, who said, "That was bold." "No," Elliot replied. "It was overdue." Later that night, Elliot joined Luis and Sophia at the community center. She handed him a new drawing. 3 stick figures, this time one in a wheelchair, one with a mop, one wearing a tie, all holding hands under a tree. "We're a team," she said proudly. Elliot looked at Luis, then back at the drawing. "Yes," he said softly. "We are." For the first time, success didn't feel like being above. It felt like standing together. Change, when real, doesn't shout. It seeps in quiet, steady, undeniable. In the days following the meeting, the office atmosphere was different. There was no sudden revolution, no roaring applause in the corridors, but people started noticing what had always been there. Executives lingered longer in the break room. Some asked the names of the cleaning crew. Others, awkward at first, struck up conversations with the front desk staff. No one mandated it. It wasn't in a memo, but the echo of Luis's words still hung in the air. If you want to lead, start by seeing. Elliot watched it unfold without claiming ownership. He didn't want credit. In truth, he didn't feel like the initiator. He felt like someone who had finally stopped looking through glass and started opening doors. He sat more often in the staff cafeteria now, sometimes alone, sometimes joined by interns or cafeteria workers or managers. He stopped taking his meals to his office. The idea of isolation had begun to taste like stale bread. One afternoon, as he waited in line for coffee, a security guard approached him cautiously. "Sir, I just wanted to say, what you and Mr. Ramirez did, it meant something." Elliot smiled. "It meant something to me, too." The guard hesitated, then added, "My son saw the recording of that meeting. Told me he'd never seen someone in a suit talk like that. Said maybe he'd apply for the internship after all." Elliot thanked him, but his voice caught in his throat. It wasn't about pride. It was about possibility. Later that week, Luis invited Elliot to his apartment. It was small, 2 rooms, faded paint, a leaky window pane, but immaculately kept. Sophia's artwork filled the walls, her wheelchair parked beside a secondhand keyboard she was learning to play. Sophia greeted Elliot with her usual exuberance. "We made empanadas. Papa said you might cry if they're too spicy." Elliot laughed. "I've survived worse. Let's test it." They ate at the tiny kitchen table. The food was simple, perfect, alive with flavor. Luis didn't apologize for the modest setting. Elliot didn't pretend to be a guest of honor. They were just 2 men sharing a meal, joined by a child who hummed between bites. After dinner, Luis stepped into the other room to take a call. Sophia leaned in toward Elliot. "Want to know a secret?" He smiled. "Always." She pointed to a drawing taped beside the door. "That one's our new house, the one we'll get when Papa finishes fixing the broken one we have now." Elliot examined it. A cozy little place with flowers and smoke curling from the chimney. 3 figures stood outside, one holding a book, one a hammer, and one himself wearing glasses and a tie. "I'm part of the house too," he asked softly. She nodded with certainty. "You helped build it." He blinked hard, then smiled. "I'll take that job." When Luis returned, Elliot stood and looked around the room once more. "Your home, it feels full." Luis looked at him. "Because we fill it." Elliot nodded, then hesitated. "Luis, I've been thinking about something. Something bigger than just reforming company policy." Luis folded his arms. "Go on. I want to start a foundation, employee-funded, company-backed, focused on workers and their families. Housing assistance, child care, emergency relief. But more than that, storytelling. A platform for their voices, their drawings, their lives, the ones we walk past." Luis didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, then at Sophia, then back at Elliot. "You're not trying to fix people, are you?" "No," Elliot said quietly. "I'm trying to listen to them." Luis considered that, then nodded. "Then I'm in." The plan was born not from a boardroom strategy session, but from a second-hand kitchen table surrounded by colored paper and chipped mugs. They gave it a name weeks later, the Ground Floor Project. A reminder that every building, every success, stands on the strength of what lies beneath. That night, as Elliot walked home under a velvet blue sky, he passed rows of buildings he used to look at without seeing. Now, he imagined what lived behind each window. The laughter, the arguments, the handwritten notes stuck to fridges, the late-night lullabies. He realized he wasn't just rebuilding a company. He was rebuilding himself, not as a man who had everything, but as a man who finally knew what mattered. The Ground Floor Project launched quietly, no fanfare, no press release, Just a single internal email signed by Elliot Grayson and Luis Ramirez, inviting employees from all departments to share their stories, needs, and ideas. It wasn't framed as charity, it was framed as collaboration. The first to respond weren't managers or executives. They were cafeteria staff, janitors, receptionists. One wrote about losing her apartment after a medical emergency. Another, a single father from shipping, shared a poem his daughter wrote about daddy's tired eyes. They weren't polished essays, and they were raw, honest glimpses into lives that had always remained in the shadows. Elliot read every word. Each story etched itself into him, deepening a truth he now carried like a scar and a compass. A person's worth was never written on their nameplate. He held a town hall-style gathering the following week. Not in the auditorium, in the warehouse loading bay, where pallets had been cleared to make room for folding chairs and donated fans. He stood on the same floor where boxes once carried the weight of products and now, hopefully, would help carry the weight of people. Louis stood beside him. Elliot didn't deliver a speech that day. He simply opened the floor. The first to speak was an older maintenance worker named George. Quiet for years, never missed a shift. He spoke about raising 3 boys on overnight wages, 2 of whom had college degrees because someone gave them an old laptop when they couldn't afford one. "I don't need much," George said, "but I need to know I matter before I'm gone." After him, others followed. A young woman from HR who was undocumented for most of her childhood. A former intern who dropped out of school when her parents lost their jobs. A warehouse foreman who spoke of watching his team age with no retirement plan, no safety net, and no voice. Elliot didn't interrupt once. He just listened. And for the first time, the company wasn't a brand or a profit machine. It was a collection of names. Each name, a story. Each story, a reason to do better. That night, he walked with Luis through the darkened city. They didn't talk much. Sometimes the deepest changes require silence to settle. When they arrived at the park, Sophia was there, sitting beside a makeshift table made from 2 milk crates. She was teaching another child how to draw flowers with torn crayons. Luis leaned in to whisper. She started talking about becoming an art teacher. Elliot smiled. She already is. Nearby, a young man approached, early 20s, tall, unsure. He wore a company badge, one of the night shift loaders. He held a folded letter in his hand. "Mr. Grayson," he said nervously, "I don't mean to interrupt. I wrote something for the ground floor thing. Didn't have the courage to submit it, but now, I think I want to." Elliot took the letter. "What's your name?" The young man hesitated. Marcus Hill." Elliot looked him in the eye. "Thank you, Marcus. Your name matters." Marcus smiled small, surprised, and walked off into the dark, his shoulders just a little straighter. Elliot turned to Luis, who was watching the moment with quiet satisfaction. "You know," Elliot said softly, "for a long time, I thought names were just about reputation, what people said about you when you weren't in the room. Now I think maybe a name only means something when someone says it without looking past you." Luis didn't say anything. He just nodded once, deeply. Later, as Elliot returned home, the city lights felt different, not colder, not distant, but layered, alive with stories he might never fully know, but now refused to ignore. He poured a glass of water, sat at his desk, and opened Marcus's letter. It began simply, "I don't know if anyone will read this, but I need to write it anyway." Elliot read every line, and when he was done, he folded it carefully, placed it beside Sophia's drawing, and wrote one sentence in his notebook. "Let this company be built on names, not titles." He closed the book, And for the first time, in a long, long time, he felt like a man living a life that finally had a name worth remembering. Autumn came quietly, brushing the city with amber light and long shadows. Leaves gathered on the pavement like memories, and the wind carried a stillness that made people pause without knowing why. In the office, the changes that had once felt radical now pulsed gently beneath everything, like a new foundation settling into place. The ground floor project had grown, not in headlines, but in impact. Childcare stipends, emergency housing support, an anonymous story wall that stood near the main entrance, where people from all levels left messages, letters, drawings, some joyful, some heartbreaking, all real. One morning, Elliot stood before that wall, reading a short note written in shaky pen I used to clean the 37th floor. No one ever spoke to me. Last week, someone asked my name. I almost cried. He reached out and touched the corner of the paper as if it might dissolve, afraid it might. Behind him, Louis approached, holding a paper cup of coffee overfilled as usual. "You all right?" he asked. Elliot nodded slowly. "Yeah, just remembering how blind I was for so long." Luis leaned beside him. "We're all blind until we're not. The trick is what you do once you start to see." They stood there a moment, two men from opposite ends of a world they were slowly rebuilding together. "Come by tomorrow," Luis added. "It's Sophia's birthday." 10 already, Elliot asked, surprised. 9, but she insists 10 is more poetic. Luis grinned. "She made her own invitation. Said I had to give it to you in person." He handed over a handmade card. Bright markers, uneven letters, a drawing of a cake with way too many candles. It read, "To Mr. E, thank you for listening. I saved you a blue cupcake. Love, Sophia." Elliot swallowed against the tightness in his chest. I wouldn't miss it. The next evening, the community center was filled with handmade streamers and balloon animals shaped like dragons. Sophia sat in her wheelchair wearing a glitter crown, her smile so wide it made everyone around her brighter. Elliot arrived just as the candles were being lit. Sophia waved furiously. "You're late," she scolded. "I brought reinforcements," Elliot replied, gesturing behind him. A group of employees followed: cafeteria workers, HR reps, a marketing intern, even a few junior execs, all holding wrapped books and snacks and handmade cards. Not one of them had come out of obligation. They came because they wanted to be part of something true. Luis gave Elliot a small smile. "You did this?" "No," Elliot said. "She did." As the candles flickered, Sophia made her wish out loud, as if secrecy wasn't necessary anymore. "I wish we stay a team forever. Laughter, clapping, cake, simple things, holy things." Later, as the party quieted, Sophia wheeled over to Elliot, her hands stained with blue frosting. "You know what Papa told me? What's that before you met us? You didn't smile with your eyes, but now you do." Elliot chuckled. "Your Papa's wiser than me?" "Nope," she said. "You're tied now." She handed him a folded paper, another drawing. This time it was a tree, big, sturdy, full of mismatched birds. At the bottom, 3 figures again. Luis with his mop, Sophia with her crown, and Elliot, still in a tie, but now with sleeves rolled up and hands in the dirt, planting another tree. On the back was a single sentence: "Sometimes families are built, not born." Elliot folded the paper and placed it gently inside his jacket pocket, not as a keepsake, as a promise. That night, as he walked back through the city, past the noise, the towers, the glowing windows, he didn't feel like a man above it all. He felt rooted, present, real, at home. And though the world hadn't changed in every way, something had. A seed had been planted, watered by kindness, truth, and the simple courage to care. And one day, years from now, someone else would sit beneath the shade of that tree because two men from two very different places decided to listen and never looked away again.